5, 6, 7, 8 big small town boys.
Let's talk about some big small town boys.
Some are bigger than the others.
Some are. We're here to talk about it. All right, here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Gilmore To Say with Tara and Haley. I'm Tara. This is Haley. Hi, Haley.
Hi, Tara.
Do you see this little nugget behind me?
She looks so cute. The paw stretched out. That's
it's
so
just
relatable.
A stretched out paw. Luna is sleeping behind me. If you're with us on YouTube, you can see her in the corner. But if you're not, it's very cute.
And if you're not, just pop on real quick just to see her.
She is exhausted already.
It's really what I want for my life right now. That
Honestly,
was me this morning.
I would love to just lay right next to her. She's just so stinking cute. She's already exhausted because we're going to be here yapping today about some boys.
I know.
Some big small town boys, some not so big small town boys. I am very excited.
Normal size and not small town men.
Ain't that the truth? Man? Singular? Is it just one?
Is it just one man?
I am so excited to talk about today's topic. I did my notes this morning and I was just getting more and more excited as everything kept going. Like as I kept typing, I'm so excited to talk about this.
Luke and Emily.
Yes.
Like the more notes that I had, the more I was like, oh, yes.
Oh, yes, exactly. And I love that this was brought to our attention. So last week, of course, we teased this episode because last year, I think it kind of came to us in two different contexts. The first was a voicemail that one of our listeners left comparing Jess and Christopher, which I thought was really fascinating. But then as we were watching seasons 4 and 5, we started to also realize that there were parallels between Dean and Luke. And I was like, wow, that's like two pairings. I have never thought to compare either of those characters to the other. And so
Jess and Chris, yes.
Jess and Chris, really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But
I had never thought about that before, ever. And I thought it was really appropriate for us to do this as our second episode of season 4 of Gilmore To Say, because during season 1 of Gilmore To Say, of course, famously, our first episode is Star-Crossed Lovers and Other Reasons to Hate Dean Forrester. But the second episode was called Dean and Logan, Logan and Jess, where we didn't necessarily compare them against one another, but we did compare like their interactions with each other and how they related to one another. And so I think that's kind of fun that today's going to be a little homage to that in a very different way.
Yeah, in a very different way. But when you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true, so fun.
Yeah.
We should just do the title as a little callback.
Exactly.
To that one.
Yeah.
Fun.
We already have our title. Perfect. You wrote in the note that I shared with you. Oh, fun.
I literally she shared a note with me last night and I read that. I literally wrote, oh, fun.
Yeah.
I'm keeping it real with y'all.
And I just was so excited to dive into this. Like I said, as I started typing, I was like, oh, I have to keep typing. Because, of course, the general consensus within the Gilmore fandom is that Jess equals Luke and Logan equals Chris.
I think it's the easy conclusion to come to.
But do you think that that was intended by Amy? Because, yes, you're right. It is obvious. But she's also mentioned things to that effect. So do you think she led us there?
Of course.
Or do you think the audience drew that conclusion on their own?
I think it's a little bit of both, because of course she said that she wrote she wrote Logan to be like Chris, that Rory kind of has a boyfriend that's like her father. But I think that she's like a smarter writer than to just like
carbon copy, like copy paste.
Yeah. To just be like, this is just this full circle where this is happening like this and this is going to occur and Jess is Luke and whatever, because the girls are so different that like to boil it down to who the men are to them is a really simple look at the show in general. It's also really fantastical, like this prophecy that you want to be fulfilled. If you really love one of these characters, if you really love Jess, then you're going to put a lot more stock in him being like Luke, because maybe you like Luke a little bit more than the other ones.
Yeah, so I think Luke is very romanticized on this show because he and Lorelai were in that will they, won't they for so long before getting together that like we kind of equate that relationship to that of Jess and Rory. And also because Jess is Luke's nephew, so inherently you want them to be tethered to each other in that way.
It makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
But like, question for you. Would Jess build an ice skating rink?
Which version of Jess? When? High school Jess? Don't think so. Why did you drop out of Yale, Jess? Maybe.
Why did you drop out of jail? Yes. Jail.
What?
Did you drop out of jail? Yes.
Wow.
You can't drop out. I mean, it's not wrong.
Did you drop out of jail? Yes.
Did go to jail. She got bailed out of jail.
You did.
She didn't drop out of jail, but
it's true.
All of that aside, I don't know that he would. I don't think that that's Jess's love language is like that acts of service sort of situation. I don't know what his love language is at all. But I think that sometimes Jess is, we've talked about romanticize. We talked about this in
that was our third episode.
Yeah, that was episode 3. That I think that people want him to be like that, but like Luke was, and so they're like, of course, that's his nephew. He would be like that too. But I don't always think he would be. I think he's his own person too.
He is. I think that his intention is similar to that of Luke kind of wanting to guide Lorelai towards resolving. Like, I'm specifically talking about her relationship with her daughter in season 6, like wants to mend those fences without like forcing her, pushing her in that direction. And I think that Jess kind of shows up for Rory in similar ways, but you could also make the argument for Logan.
Yeah. And
like doesn't necessarily force her, but encourages her. Like the way that Luke yells at Lorelai on the roof of the house when he's like, I'm in the middle and, you know, blah, blah, blah. You got to fix this. I feel like that is giving Jess, why did you drop out of Yale? So I think that their intentions are similar. Maybe their execution is not so similar.
Yeah. And I just think it comes down to them as people and whatever service they're providing to the plot at the time.
But here's what I will say. I do think that Dean would have built Rory an ice skating rink.
I think so too.
And that's what we're here to talk about today. So, as we mentioned before, a lot of people do kind of equate these characters at the end of the story. You know, Jess being Luke, Logan being Christopher. But it was brought to our attention that there are some similarities between Dean and Luke and Jess and Chris. And I'd love to start with, in my opinion, the most obvious pairing of these two duos, which is Dean and Luke. And today we're going to be making some pro-con lists together of how they're similar, how they're different, and land on the conclusion together for both couples, if you will, at the end of the episode. So I'd like to start with Dean and Luke.
Yeah. And I think in terms of conclusion, I think that at the end of it, I admittedly will probably feel the same that I do at the beginning. Less like you did at the beginning of Emily and Luke, where you're like, but by the end of it, you're like, oh. I think that there are so many differences, but I think the similarities are just, that's what we're here to tell you. But I think at the end of it, I will think that they are more different than they are alike.
Really?
Yeah.
That's where you stand right now.
Oh my gosh, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I won't feel the same. Tara, just your face, you were like, I was like, no, I backtracked. All of that's gone.
Earlier when you said to me that you had a few similarities, I was like, can't relate. I have a whole list right here.
Well, Tara, bring us your whole list then.
So here's the thing. When I wrote down Dean versus Luke, next to it, I wrote you and me. Same thing.
That's what I wrote down. That was my first one.
That is pretty much the last thing that Dean says in the series, besides A Year in the Life. But he says it to Luke in To Live and Let Diorama in season 5, which is Dean's last appearance in the original series, when he's all mad at Luke and he like won't talk to him, and Dean's and like or why? Luke is like, all right, man, what's up? You upset with me because of the bop it? Like, let's talk about it. And the reason that he's, of course, all grumbly with him is because he's watching Luke in a relationship with Lorelai, watching him basically live out what he wanted with Rory, and saying to him like, enjoy your girlfriend while you still have one. He's such an ass.
See, that's the thing is like a lot of that I do agree with to an extent with Dean, but also Dean is like angry and you're like, dude, why are you just sowing seeds of doubt in this man's mind?
Well, especially because like right after that is when Luke puts in the bid on the house and gets the house. But then Lorelai gets this opportunity with the Durham group to maybe travel more, and she's considering it. And he's thinking to himself, oh, fuck. Like, I wonder if there were seeds of doubt that were planted by Dean that then kind of manifested in him not taking the Twickham house. But there is another kind of callback that Dean presents in saying like they want more than this that I'm really intrigued to get into today, because it was something that I didn't think about until I really started diving into this topic. But I want to put a pin in that because to that, I know we say this a lot about Dean on the pod and it's kind of an insult, but we call him a big small town boy. And if we're being honest, Luke is also kind of a big small town boy.
Can I tell you, I think Luke is the bigger big small town boy.
Big small town boy.
I think that Dean's taller, but like just like size wise, I think he like physically is taller, but like I think he is Dean's the bigger taller, of the big small town boys.
Bigger.
But Dean's from Chicago just a couple seasons ago.
Yeah, he's the new kid.
Years ago.
The new kid, according to Lane, he is the new kid. And then all of a sudden he's big small town boy by like season 2.
Yeah. All of a sudden this is his town, Jess. So I think that this is Luke's town.
It really is.
When he fights Dean in the street, I'm like, yeah, just 2 big small town boys fighting. But this really is Luke's small town.
Yeah. Born and raised. I mean, this is his town. I think that, you know, if you kind of go back to the beginning, though, of Luke's life and kind of what we know about him, we're seeing a lot of who Dean is as a reflection of perhaps who Luke was in high school. Very similar high school experiences in that they were both very athletic on a lot of teams, not necessarily the highest of achievers academically, but both very hard workers. And to that end, like worked through high school, had jobs after school at like a town locale, like Williams Hardware, Dosey's. Both are very handy. So they have like freelance work on top of the fact that they have these standing jobs. And like, you know, in the sense that like Luke will bring Bert around for the inn, and like, you know, Dean will also work at the inn, but with Tom, and, you know, they kind of have that connection there. And so I think that that's very similar in that we've kind of been talking about how Lane and Mrs. Kim's relationship might be a real-time reflection of what Lorelai and Emily's relationship was. I wonder if we're seeing a lot of who Luke used to be as a reflection of who Dean is, as he's like endeared to the town. Yeah,
and I don't know if that's a coincidence, because all I can remember is when Lorelai in season 1 says that Dean reminds her of Chris. And so it's one of those things of like, do we believe the dialogue because that was intentional, that's something they want the audience to know, or do we look at this like objectively and we're like, no, Dean is the most like Luke in terms of background. I mean, we don't know anything about his Chicago upbringing.
No, but by the time
they clearly have very different tastes in music.
And I'm sure they do. I don't think that, you know, Dean's listening to Jimmy Buffett.
No, he liked Liz Phair.
Right, Liz Phair. It's true. But I think that the way that they show up for their families are very similar. Their relationship and connection to their family seems very similar. We don't know a ton about their parents. They have little sisters.
Who are kind of kooky.
A little kooky, both blonde.
Both probably afraid of horses. Is Liz afraid of horses? I don't know. I wrote that down. I was sort of like, I bet she would be.
Honestly, maybe. But I think that they are very family-oriented guys. Yeah. And I think that, like, you know, we don't get to see their interactions really with their parents, but we hear a lot about it. And so in that way, I do think that they are very similar. We don't see them. We don't really meet them, especially because at the point that we meet Luke, both of his parents have passed. And at the time that we meet Dean, we don't really get a ton. We just hear a lot. And the stories that they share is a very traditional, like, you know, mother, father, sister, brother kind of family.
That sounded a little bit like that Ashley Simpson song.
Really? What song?
You know, the father, sister, brother, sister, mother. That, you know, everything's cool now.
I was thinking of Next to Normal. Good. Did you ever listen to Next to Normal, the soundtrack?
Probably.
Father, mother, sister, brother.
See?
It's also giving To Live and Let Die Rama. And I love Jesus.
Wait, that's totally Dean's family.
Okay. But you mentioned Christopher Returns, and you mentioned that, like, you know, prior to that, when Lorelai sees, I think it's in Kiss and Tell in season 1, before Christopher really comes on the scene, the only like frame of reference we really have for him is that there is some resemblance between Christopher and Dean. Like he looks like Christopher, and there's this reminder
Do you think
there.
he does?
They're
both men.
They're both guys.
They both have faces.
Yeah.
And I don't think they look that much alike.
No, they not at all. But I think that there's a reminder there of like, oh, your first love, your first like high school crush, and those feelings that exist there. And yeah, I guess I could like see it. I could see the comparison, but I don't think they're like doppelgangers or anying.
No.
You know?
I would not look at that man and be like, oh my gosh, he reminds me so much of Chris.
Yeah, it's true. But what I thought was very fascinating, to take the pin out of what Dean says to Luke towards the end of his time on the show.
I forgot we had a pin in it.
We had a pin. He says they want more than this. And I also think that's a little bit of a callback to Luke's relationship with Rachel. We never got to see the early years of that play out. We only got to hear about it and then see her return. But I do think that we could equate what we know about Luke and Rachel to Dean and Rory. If we really like want to stretch our brains a little bit here, Rachel wanted more than the small town life, and Luke could not offer that to her. And Rory's aspirations really outgrew Dean in a way that he felt like he couldn't offer her any more than who he was. And so moreover, in like the last iteration of their relationship, like when he's standing outside of the Gilmores, outside of his truck, which they both drive trucks, pickup trucks.
I wrote that down.
I think that
Big small town trucks.
Big small town boy trucks. He says like, I don't belong here. And I think that with Luke, he was very, very hurt up until the point that he met Lorelai and like started to, you know, see a future with somebody who wasn't Rachel. I think that there was a big hole in his heart over being left and kind of abandoned, for lack of a better term, for the exciting, adventurous world that existed out there for Rachel. And I'm not saying that Rory did the exact same thing, but there was kind of that lingering over them that Dean carries around, that I think Luke probably carried around for a really long time at Dean's age, because arguably that's kind of when
that's interesting.
Rachel, I think, left. If we, you know, look at the timeline the way that we did a couple of years ago, I think that she broke his heart in a very similar way, in a way where it wasn't intentional. There was love there. And I think there was love between Rory and Dean. There was safety and familiarity there, but that Rory ultimately was going to want more than what Dean was able to offer her. And it sounded like the same was true of Luke. Luke was staying in Stars Hollow. He was working at his dad's hardware store, if not turning it into a diner. And Rachel was like, I want to go out and I want to have adventures. I don't know that Rory knew that about herself quite yet, but she did have aspirations that existed outside of Stars Hollow that would have made her relationship with Dean really hard.
No, she did for the most part. And like, I think that's really true. I admittedly am putting the second half, if we're putting like Dean and Rory part 2, like if Younger Them is part 1, even though there was 2 parts to that, I'm kind of putting it in line a little bit with Nicole too, because it was like this sense of like convenience. She just happened to show up next door one day, and he made it happen because Lorelai was with someone else. I don't think that is why Dean and Rory
Lindsay?
part 2 happened. I don't think it was because she was with someone else, but I think it was that familiarity. This is what we're doing now. But it was never right. Like that was never how things were supposed to be.
Totally.
And she just didn't fit there. And she was never from there, but so there's a lot of differences there. But it just didn't work because she was never going to stay in that small town for him.
Yeah. I do think though that like you could also compare Luke and Nicole getting married to Dean and Lindsay getting married. Speaking to, you know, she's with somebody else. So
yeah, it doesn't just have to apply to Rory for them to be similar.
Yeah. It's like, this works. And I do have feelings for this person. I think that Luke genuinely had feelings for Nicole. Dean genuinely had feelings for Lindsay, but ultimately they wanted to be with a Gilmore Girl, and they got married to other people. They went so far as to get married in different ways. I think that Dean, both of them were premature, but very different.
Dean's was premature. I think age-wise, I don't think they'd been together long enough to really figure out that that's what they wanted. I think that Luke's was premature because they were on a boat and they should have just waited till they got back to land.
But premature in the sense that like they were very clearly not in a place to get married yet, but for whatever reason felt that that was the time and seized the opportunity, seized the moment. I do think that like, again, I think Dean really liked Lindsay, and when he started dating her was very enamored by her. When you see them at the hockey game in the big one in season 3, like they very much look like they're together and like happy. And he's like, yeah, I really didn't know how to tell you about that to Rory. And I do think the same is true of Luke. Like he starts dating someone else and it's like, oh wow, I really like this woman, meets her parents, etc., you know. And all of this is kind of happening around the same time, which I find interesting, especially because in A Tale of Pose and Fire, well, yeah, they're both blonde. But in A Tale of Pose and Fire, we kind of get
that little
this
parallel moment
of iciness from Lindsay and from Nicole towards Rory.
I think Nicole
and
has red hair
Lorelai.
then.
Yeah, Nicole does have red hair. When she comes back in season 4, she has blonde hair.
Yeah, and that's how we know it's wrong. Because she's blonde.
Well, yeah. So that I felt was also kind of a parallel between the two of them, is that they prematurely got married to people who they very clearly weren't in love with, or at least in love with enough to see their marriage through, because the second that Rory came knocking, obviously Dean was out. I don't think...
One of mine was that Luke cons is that Luke leaves his marriage before getting together with the Gilmore Girl.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is one of the differences between the two of them is that Luke, I don't think, would ever cheat on a partner in general, and didn't. So,
and that's on facts.
And that's on facts.
I also think a lot of that has to do with something that we were talking about before. It's just they value family, and in valuing family, like as a single person, like you can value your family, but you have to think about what that means for you in your future and what you want. And from Donna Reed, Dean wanted like to be a family man. He wanted to have kids. He wanted a wife who was going to be like his mom. And I think that Luke, being very similar, I think that he also wanted a traditional family. Judging from the fact that he got the Twickham house and he saw filling it up with kids, like when he was being like so like weird about it when they were talking about the dragonfly. But it's very clear that that is both what both of them want for their life. And it seems like they want it with a Gilmore Girl, and one of them is kind of too young to put that into play into her own hopes and aspirations for her life and her ambitions, because she very clearly has a set plan for her life, whereas Lorelai is incorporating family into her plan for herself because of the status of her relationship and because of the fact that she already has a daughter, and she's thinking about more of that in the future. So I think it's kind of just like the reaction that their partner has to that. But I think that even as Luke is like trying to marry trying to marry Nicole rather, I think he still has that in mind, knowing that it might not be right, but still wants that for his life.
Well, it's very interesting that you bring that up, because I never thought about the fact that like when it's shared with the Gilmore Girl that they're either getting married or got married, the Gilmore Girl has a very intense reaction. And I know that there are feelings there like underneath it all. For Rory, I'm not sure so much.
She was kind of just judgy.
She was just kind of judgy, but also like, what the fuck are you doing? And I do think the same is true of Lorelai, that she's like, what are you doing? And we kind of end season 3 with that looming between Rory being like, why are you getting married? You're literally a fetus. And Lorelai in Luke's dream showing up and being like, you know, don't get married while you're away. And then having the reaction she does at the end of the summer when season 4 kicks off and he tells her that they got married.
Yeah.
I didn't
But he
think
feels the
about
same that she does. Where she's like, he's like, I shouldn't have done this. Hee.
Whereas Dean doesn't necessarily share the same sentiments.
No.
But in turn gets really reactive with her, which brings me to my next point, which is that I do think that they tend to have really big reactions to things, but then also simultaneously retreat in times of conflict after getting like really angry. And I know that these are different situations, but in There's the Rub, where famously Dean shows up and Jess is there, and Rory did lie to Dean. She did not tell him that Jess was there. She said Paris is over, and she did ask for like space that night, but Dean ends up coming over very innocently to give her some ice cream, sees Jess there. They get in each other's faces, and then he starts screaming at Rory. He has a very, very strong reaction to her before she can really explain to him what went wrong. I do think that you could kind of compare that up against in season 6, the episode title is escaping me, but when Chris calls and the voicemail starts playing and Lorelai doesn't know that he's calling. Yeah. She and Suki are listening to this voicemail. He comes in, hears his voice, and just instantly, very differently flies off the handle in a way where he just completely blames her, doesn't give her a chance to explain, and is like, we're not going to talk about this right now, but then starts arguing with her in the same kitchen where Dean was chastising Rory. I know they're very different situations, but it's similar in that, like, first of all, Rory and Lorelai both did not ask for either of those men to come over and or call. They did not seek that out. It did start innocently, but their partners reacted very extremely to it. And I do think that that is because of the way they feel about each person, which I'll get to later.
I know. I was
That's a
say
similarity.
that exists also in season 5, that like when Lorelai's like, oh, I had lunch with Chris. And then later he's like, it's okay that you had lunch with Chris. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. I actually didn't know that I was going to...
Needed your permission
to have lunch with my daughter's father.
Yeah.
So like there is that like element too, that like I put that as like possessiveness, that sometimes that can cause an outsized reaction that we see from them that is a little explosive.
Yeah. And I think possessiveness is a bit of I mean, it's definitely a word I would use to describe Dean. I don't know that I would use it to describe Luke, but I do think
use it always.
Yeah.
But sometimes he will step up and
and I think that when both of these situations kind of simmer a little, like, or less before they simmer, when they build up and then there's kind of a blowout and then all of a sudden they simmer, we see Dean kind of retreat. He's like, I'm going to go home. Luke runs away to his man cave above the diner.
Yeah.
And that's
or
kind of
gone fishing.
or he's gone fishing after they get into a really big fight. You know, there's a lot of passion there. There's a lot of yelling, like screaming at each other in the street or in the middle of the dance marathon kind of a thing. That I think draws a bit of a parallel to the way that these men react. But I don't think Luke's reactions are as extreme or explosive is a good word as Dean's, which you could equate to the fact that he's a teenager and still learning how to manage his emotions. But on the whole, like, they do kind of have very strong reactions to things.
Yeah. I feel like he has very strong reactions, but Luke is more often going to push him down and react to them later. Maybe.
Very
I'm not
true.
Sure if that is always true.
It's not always true. Whereas Dean is a little bit more consistent in his approach to things. He's very reactive.
Right then.
Luke can be reactive, but it really does kind of depend on the situation. There are times when he can be a lot, he can simmer and he can settle a lot more and get a little more passive aggressive. But I also think that comes with age, and maybe, again, I sometimes wonder if Dean is a reflection of who Luke used to be.
Could be.
I don't know.
Now, a question about the possessiveness, the kind of jealousy that exists. Do you think that's tied to that idea that Dean placed, is that you and me, same thing, that it comes from like a feeling of not being worthy necessarily for these girls, that they have to kind of protect their space in these girls' lives, because if they don't, they might get sideswiped straight out of it? Do you think that Luke reacted the way that he did to being like, oh, it's okay that you had lunch with Chris, because he has to think about the fact that they have a lot of history together, and he could end up on the outs pretty easily. Took him a long time to get her.
I think I would draw that parallel more to Jess and Luke than I would to Dean and Luke, because Dean's possessiveness comes from a lot of jealousy, and Luke does have some insecurities and clearly a little bit of, I don't know if I'd call it jealousy with Christopher, just an acknowledgement of history. I think that Jess in That'll Do Pig when in season 3, when he realizes that Rory and Dean got lunch together and they are now forging some sort of friendship, he is like, I just really wish you would have told me. And he's like, it's fine. Okay. Like, I don't like him, but I think that he also accepts that A, he's not going to control her, and B, that like there's history there. Like, you guys spent years together. And of course, you're going to be friends to a certain extent. I don't like him.
And he really doesn't understand it.
No, he doesn't get it.
Because once he has a daughter, he's like, oh, yeah, of course. Of course,
you're talking about
in
Luke.
her life.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Like, of course he's going to be in your life. Like, the little flip is like, once he like gets it,
totally.
It's like, oh. I could have understood this years ago if only I would have known I had a daughter.
Totally. One of the last ones that I have is that their relationships with Emily are kind of similar in that both men are seen by her as beneath the Gilmore Girls. You know, they drive a truck, they drink beer, they're not quote unquote from good breeding. And there's this instinct from the Gilmores to try and set them up with better suitors in an effort to keep them apart from these men.
Yeah. Especially the male Yale party specifically was born because they didn't want her to be with Dean.
And I think that they have a little bit more affection towards Luke, or at least Richard does. I think Richard really hated Dean when he met him.
Oh,
whereas
immediately.
Yeah.
I think they gain one for Luke.
They gain one, right.
Yeah. Because he sticks around long enough by the time you've been Gilmore that he's accepted into the family. Mm-hmm. But after You Jump, I Jump Jack, they're like, okay, cool. Let's scheme our way out of this and invite Chris to our wedding vow renewal in a couple of episodes from now.
Yeah, totally. That's kind of...
I didn't think about the fact that all happens in the same season. They're like
within episodes of one another.
Yeah, let's get these girls out of these relationships.
I didn't think about that until I was writing this down. I was like, wow, they really did scheme. They were really scheming
and dreaming,
specifically with Emily. Like, Emily is the one to really spearhead that. Richard is along for the ride, but he's not necessarily going out of his way to do that.
Well, he thinks of it less, I think, in like a scheming to get Luke out of the relationship sort of way. And he's trying to think about like, okay, this is who Lorelai chose. Let's shave him. Like,
exactly.
Because he says to Emily, you're not thinking ahead. And Emily's like, actually, I am. I'm just going to bulldoze the whole situation to the ground.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't need to plan at all. You're not thinking big enough. Let's ruin it.
It's giving Sharpay Evans. Yes. Bigger. The last one I have here that is going to make you laugh is that these boys love to kick things. Dean loves kicking duffel bags. Luke loves kicking pillows.
I do. I said they love a fight in the street.
They love a fight in the street.
That's like on the same level that like they love to kick things. They love to kick a duffel. They love to kick a car.
Well, let's see. That was really the last one that I put down, was that they're both massively threatened by Jess and Christopher, respectively. They've also both had physical fights with Jess and Christopher, respectively.
They love a physical fight.
They love a physical fight.
Yeah.
So it's that was the last one I had, which then I wrote, which speaking of, because those are the two, of course, that we're going to compare up against each other next. But I'd love to hear some of the cons that you put down, or if you have any similarities that I missed that I didn't cover.
Most of my similarities were more just like concise ideas of what you had to say. The real con that I have for the two of them is that Luke and Dean are very different types of characters within the show. Dean is like a reactive character that serves the plot of Rory. We see him sometimes out on his own, but if it's with Jess and he's still serving the plot, how he's going to affect Rory's storyline. And we see him with Lorelai, and that is again affecting the plot of A Gilmore Girl, and it's usually going to end up being Rory's. Whereas Luke is his own character. Yeah. We see his own storylines. We see things affecting him that have nothing to do with the Gilmore Girls. Ultimately, it comes back to his storyline with Lorelai, but not all the time. Sometimes it's just completely something that is going on in his own life that is not dependent on how Lorelai's storyline is progressing. And so I think that that's really the core con for me, and really all of the other differences that could exist, I think exist mostly in that one. and sometimes offsets completely how similar they can be because they are just purely different characters as devices.
Like you said, they serve completely different purposes, and like Dean doesn't ever really stand alone. He is just a boyfriend, which is fine. Luke is not just a love interest. He exists so much deeper than that within the story, and he has his own story, and we're invested in him outside of the fact that he's a love interest. So I totally agree with you there.
Yeah, I think so too. That you also agree. That's not what I meant to say. I think so too. I think that you also agree with me.
I do.
Oh my gosh. We could say that a con of theirs is the age difference, because Dean is obviously a teenager and Luke is obviously an adult, and the way that they are going to operate as characters and as people is naturally going to be different. But I think that that is just like too obvious of a con to really put it there. We can, but I think that something that comes from that doesn't necessarily have to do with age, and it can, but I think Luke has more inclination towards softness than Dean does. I mean, Dean is romantic in a sense and really wants to date Rory. Like, I'm immediately thinking of Star-Crossed Lovers. That date that he takes her on is very sweet. He wants to do some grand gestures for her, like build the car, and he is also going to be someone who's going to show up for her. It does require some convincing. Like, he has to play, what is it called? Robot blocks? Robots fighting?
BattleBots,
whatever that is. Can't even remember the name for it. And he has that boyfriend quality that I think that the writers were trying to make him like the perfect first boyfriend, which is a quote from Rory in the revival. But I think that Luke is just softer in general, that he has like a softer interior world, even if we're not always privy to it, because he is someone who like hates the town doing things like the war reenactment. But in Love and War and Snow, he brings them hot drinks. He's always going to like resist these things, but ultimately give in to them. And that's not to say that Dean wouldn't bring them hot drinks, because I think that Dean does have a respect for authority. He respects Taylor Dosey. I think if anyone in the show has the most respect for him, it's Dean and everything he does for him. They do have
very different relationships with Taylor Dosey.
Oh, very different relationships.
But I also agree with you that kind of comes with age. I think that Luke he's very respectful Taylor, yes, he's respectful of his elders.
Fights Luke in the street, but Luke goes out and fights him.
I was going to say, Luke puts him in a headlock.
And I think maybe it's a thing that comes with age, but I think that there's just a softness to Luke that
Dean doesn't quite have,
that a teenage boy wouldn't have.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Would totally agree with that. But admittedly, I kind of think there are more similarities than there are differences between the two of them. Is that bold?
No.
Is that bold of me to say?
That's bold.
I just had so much to say about how similar they are.
You did. They are, and I think that's the thing, is like they are very similar, and like there are a lot of differences between the two of them, but I think it really just comes down to character purposes. And I think that Dean is more of a device than he is like a main character driving the show forward. And we see, I mean, in 7, Luke gets his own storyline winding off on his own, but even earlier in the series, he gets his own exploration with Jess that we just can't attribute to Dean. I mean, that's something that's true of Dean and Logan, that they're just boyfriends. And that's okay. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with just being a boyfriend.
You're a little bit more invested in Logan's like exterior life.
You get a lot more context for his life, I think, than
exactly.
Dean's. Yeah. But because I think the context for Dean's is just that he moved from Chicago and now he lives in this town and he plays hockey, and he's probably the most likely to be named Butch Forrester outside of Butch Danes.
It just doesn't roll off the tongue like
it
Butch
doesn't.
Danes took the
What nickname
field.
could we give Dean?
Oh God, I don't know. Skippy Forrester.
Why does that sound like a natural peanut butter brand? Skippy's new natural peanut butter. Skippy Forester. Peanuts straight from the forest where peanuts do not grow.
I love it. But yeah, I kind of felt like there were way more similarities than there were differences here. It's just differently from how we just recently compared Luke up against Emily.
I know.
I think that the characters of Luke and Emily serve a similar purpose in Lorelai's life, whereas here I'm comparing Dean and Luke within the narrative itself and less in how they serve the story. So that's kind of the difference here, because I'm like, I would never say that Dean and Emily are similar, but I would compare both of them up against Luke, and now we both have in very different ways, you know?
No, I mean, that's true. I wouldn't say that Dean and Emily are similar.
Yeah.
But
I know.
Luke and it's squares and rectangles here.
It really is. But speaking of Dean and Luke and kind of their rivalries with other men in the Gilmore Girls' lives, the other comparison that we wanted to make today is between Jess and Christopher, and how I wrote you and me, same thing next to Dean and Luke. I wrote great 1 minute, gone the next to these two.
The thing that I put under there is to quote Cardigan by Taylor Swift, leaving like a father, running like water. That sums up the two of these guys.
It really does. And it wasn't until I thought about it, until one of our listeners called in and suggested this, that I was like, wow, yes. And the first thing that came to mind is the way that Lorelai and Rory both speak about these characters in relation to what kind of relationships they have had with them and how unreliable they are. It's never really about how they feel about these guys, because admittedly, that can be a little ambiguous. I think Lorelai's feelings towards Christopher are a little clearer after they end things versus Rory, because once they break up, we have no
while
idea.
They're together and not.
We just don't know how she feels about him.
I think
we know how she feels
just
about
a
him.
Rory Lorelai difference too. Is
totally.
We know more about how Lorelai feels about things in general.
When Lorelai talks about Christopher in Christopher Returns, when we get our first like real context for who Christopher is, we've laid eyes on the man.
And he arrives on a motorcycle. Wait, both of them arrive on a mode of transportation.
They do.
He rides up on a motorcycle. Jess rides up on a bus.
And I thought he was wearing a leather jacket at first, but he is not. I think he's wearing a puffer.
Best era.
Now, when he leaves, he's wearing a leather jacket. It is kind of his signature. I wouldn't say a leather jacket is necessarily Christopher's signature, but...
No, his is stacking CDs while he's on the phone.
You're so right. Anyway, Lorelai has a couple conversations with Suki, with Rory, where she speaks to Christopher and who he is, and we're getting the context for how she feels about him and why they're not together. And... what she says to Suki when they have a conversation about Chris as a whole, she says, I mean, no matter how many years go by, no matter how long I don't see him for, whenever I do, it's always ... Christopher. That's how she describes him. She says, it's just Christopher. And then when Rory is having that conversation with Lane at the end of season 4, when Jess comes to her and is like, run away with me, let's go to New York. Like, I want this, which I will talk about in a second. And she's describing that conversation to Lane. She says, he was just Jess. I mean, he shows up out of nowhere with this crazy proposal, but Jess is great 1 minute, gone the next. You know, as far as I know, I could have said yes, packed my bag, and by the time I got to the car, he would have changed his mind. And Lane and Suki kind of offer very similar things here. They're like, but that's so cool. That's so romantic. Like, Suki is like, oh my God, this man is here. And both of these girls are like, yeah, but it's Jess. He was Jess.
Yeah.
He was Christopher. And that's kind of how they describe these two people who they have such rich history with. I would argue that Lorelai and Christopher have a much deeper, longer history than Rory and Jess. But by the time we get to a year in the life, like, Rory and Jess have kind of settled into a similar rapport to Christopher and Lorelai, that they have this friendship that will always be rooted in the feelings that they had for each other when they were kids.
But very different because they don't have that like connection that is like keeping them together in the form of a child that like will always exist. It's more of like familial aspects of like your mom is dating my uncle. It's more along those lines that I think it's more of like just based in like respect for what we had, because one of the main similarities between them is just the young love that they shared with the Gilmore Girls, and how they pull that through line through their life is very different. I mean, neither of them end up with the Gilmore Girl, but
I think that they'll always be pining for a Gilmore Girl.
Yeah, I see this is where season 7 kind of messes with things, because if I had the sort of reaction like interaction with Lorelai in season 7 that Chris does, I don't think I would continue pining for her after that. But I think after a season 6 interaction, I think I might. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that sort of marriage would really fizzle that out. But if we can kind of like drop that just a touch.
Well, my question for you is, do you think that with the glimpse of Christopher that we get in A Year in the Life, do you think he's still pining for Lorelai? Do you think there's any feeling there for him of like, you know, I really wish that could have worked out?
I don't know. I think something about Chris in the revival is he feels really spineless. Like he just feels like even if you were going to pine for this person, you're still so connected to your daughter and to her mother. But it just feels like you gave up, if that was the case, that like pining for her was more important than this relationship that you have. I don't know. I don't know if I'd even justify it as pining as much as just like,
we get pining
felt like
from
he just
Jess.
left.
Yeah.
Well, that look through the window really fucked us all up, didn't it?
I know.
I wouldn't have said that. I wouldn't have said that he was pining if we didn't get that.
I know, me too.
I would have just felt like they were friends, and I would have been really fine with that. But I love a nice yearning. Love a yearn.
We love yearning.
But I think that in the revival, when it gets to Jess, I just think that he's landed in a much more emotional, like, this is all just projection on this man who has no backstory in this revival. He just seems more emotionally stable in his life than Chris does.
100%. I think that most people in the fandom would agree with that. I think I do. I certainly do. But I think that something that we witnessed through the original series between these two men is that they very rashly approach the Gilmore Girls with like these absolutely insane proposals. One of them is quite literally a proposal. And I think that that's also where I draw some of the biggest parallels between the two of them is in Christopher Returns, when he says, I want to marry you. And Lorelai's like, what the fuck? Like, where did the fucking come from? I haven't seen you in God knows how long. And now you're going to be like, I want to marry you. Now, granted, they have a child together. They just had sex the night before. You know, there are things that would kind of like lead him to believe that maybe she would say yes. More things than when Jess approaches Rory at the end of season 4 and Last Week Fights This Week Tights shows up to regale Dorm and is like, come with me to the Emerald City.
They get on a train, they go see the wizard. No, and even though this is not necessarily his intention, when Chris comes in Haunted Leg in season 3, when he shows up at Friday night dinner and is yelling at her, and this is when Rory says, go be someone else's dad, which is one of my favorite things she says, and Emily makes him leave. I think that maybe feels more similar to Jess just busting in, because Chris was already there when this conversation came up in season 1. But it's kind of just that
time
rashness.
They're both in leather jackets.
Oh, well, look at that. That it's just like, it's that moment of just showing up out of the blue because they know where they are, and like asking more of them than they can really offer. Because like Jess is saying, run away with me. It's like, what could we possibly do? Like, once we run away together, what are we having for dinner tonight when we run away? Like, have you thought that far ahead?
No. And that's kind of what Lorelai says to Rory at the end of Christopher Returns, when Rory says, he wanted you to marry him, didn't he? And she's like, is that so crazy? Why do you think that's so crazy? And Lorelai says to her, he wants things he's not ready for. And that is Jess Mariano. He wants things he's not ready for.
And I think that's pretty true of both of them in like the first 4 seasons, and that they both want things that they're not ready for.
Totally.
And they both end up with things that they're not ready for. But I think that as Jess progresses and when we see him again, I actually think that in season 6, they end up in very similar places. I think that they have like a very similar pattern where it feels like the season 6 version of them is the right fit, but each of the Gilmore Girls adamantly wants someone else. Like Lorelai is just so fixated on the fact that maybe this isn't going to work, but she's not going to leave it. And Lorelai, little Lorelai, if you will, Rory says to not Logan's face, to Jess's face, that she's in love with Logan despite all the bad. This is who she wants. And yeah, I think that we're presented with these options of like Chris is like finally respecting boundaries and really only supporting them as they ask, and showing up and apologizing and doing all these things that like are making him look like a great guy. And Jess is like finally in this space of like, he wrote a book, he's paying Luke back, he's thanking Luke, he thinks that he, you know, helped Rory get back to where she was. And as it turns out, she's still not the girl for him because she's in love with someone else. And I think that is such an interesting idea between the two of them to have like bum rushed the girls with these big feelings that they have, and then for us to be presented with these versions of them that they won't have.
Yeah, that's so real. And I didn't think about the fact that Lorelai and Rory both turn to both of these people in season 6 when they're not getting what they want from their other partners.
Yeah, just by kind of coincidence of them being an option that's there. That's
and almost that like
them.
There is a friendship that could exist between them, both of them, with both Gilmore Girls, that I think gets kind of sideswept by the fact that they then, you know, Rory and Jess kiss, Lorelai and Christopher sleep together. Who knows what that would have brought if Amy had written season 7. I don't know that they would have gotten married, but we'll talk about that more later this year. But I think that, you know, with Jess, obviously his intentions in Philadelphia when he sees that she's shown up, like we talked about this recently in The Real Paulinka on Patreon, you know, he's kind of assuming she's there and like reading his book, and she came there alone because like maybe there's a possibility.
Says everything fixed.
Everything fixed? Yeah, I guess.
And in his mind that included the
Logan.
blonde to get Yale.
Yeah. And I do think that Chris, like you said, was starting to respect boundaries until Lorelai showed up at the end of season 6 to sleep with him. And to feel that sense of being wanted. And I don't know if that's why Rory showed up to Philadelphia, and we talk about that on Patreon, but it does end up being that way. She's like, I couldn't even cheat on him the way that he cheated on me. And it's just, it's interesting to see the parallels there of how both Gilmore Girls treat this person in their lives who they've had such, you know, flip-flopped feelings and relationships with, very like ambiguous kind of relationships where the feelings again stem from young love and were so passionate, but it just was like wrong timing, maybe right person, but that person isn't necessarily who I need them to be just yet. Like they're not ripe enough yet
like
for me.
Wrong version of the right person, wrong time is really what it is, because it's like, and I think that's right person, wrong time. I think that's the core of what it is like this person could be that person, but this is not the right time for them, because season 4 version of Jess versus season 6, right person, wrong time.
Totally.
Wrong person, right time. When she goes to kiss not her boyfriend.
right But I think there was potential for like, okay, we can have a friendship here between both Jess and Rory and Lorelai and Chris. At that time they had reached even ground, and like you said, there were these versions of them that were like, oh, this could be the guy, or it could be someone in your life where like you now have peace with because they've grown up. And instead I really do think in both instances the Gilmore Girls ruined the friendship. I agree.
That it feels like these are two...
Jess kisses Rory. He leans in for that.
Okay, but he thought that she was not with
100%.
anyone.
No, I'm not saying he like,
no.
you know,
I
did
Rory
anything
allows
wrong.
it, and Rory knowing she has a boyfriend
totally
ruined it.
Yeah.
Because all she had to say was, "Oh, nope, we're friends. We can be friends." You know, and that's really what it is like, I think that they can pull at this very comfortable little string in the back of their back and be like, you know, we're right back at it. But not anymore, because I decided what I wanted was not you. When they were like at the peak of being who they could be for them.
Yeah.
Sad.
So true. Another comparison, and like arguably one of the biggest that first came to mind when I was thinking about comparing these two characters up against each other, was not only in the way that Lorelai and Rory talk about them and the ways that they show up for them, you know, in season 1, in season 4, but also kind of comparing Jess busting into Yale while Dean is there and being like, I need to talk to you, feels very Wedding Bell Blues in the way that the dialogue is presented, in the way that the feelings are presented. Because when Jess shows up at the end of season 4, first of all, to compare Luke and Dean a little bit, when that all happens, they run away. Actually, Rory asks Dean to leave, and then they're all pissed off, all put out, reacting kind of similarly. Luke's was a little more understandable. Dean, you're literally married, but
he was invited. He was the plus one. He was the guest.
Correct. When Jess shows up and they start having this conversation, Jess says to her, look, we'll go to New York, we'll work, we'll live together, we'll be together. It's what I want. It's what you want too. I want to be with you, but not here, not this place, not Stars Hollow. We have to start new. You're packed. Your stuff is in boxes. It's perfect. You're ready. And I'm ready. I'm ready for this. You can count on me now. I know you couldn't count on me before, but you can now. You can. Look, you know we're supposed to be together. I knew it the first time I saw you 2 years ago, and you know it too. I know you do. And then in season 5, Wedding Bell Blues, when Christopher and Luke and Lorelai are all kind of having this scuffle outside of the room where Logan and Rory are, Chris says, Lorelai and I, Mackin. Chris says, Lorelai and I belong together. Everyone knows it. I know it. Emily knows it. Look, I blew it, okay? I know that I blew it. You waited and I didn't come through, and now you're with him, but it's not too late. It's not too late. I know it's not too late. Emily told me it wasn't too late. I mean, that's why I'm here, okay? I know you're with him, but it's for now. It's not forever. It's just for now. I know that. And so I feel like those two sentiments are very similar. It's not necessarily, Jess's is not comparing it up against like, you're with him now and I know that, but we're going to be together. But it is this kind of Delulu idea of, you waited and I know you waited for me and I wasn't ready, but I am now. I'm ready now and I can do this and I can show up. And it's going to be okay because we belong together and everybody knows it. I know it. You know it. Emily knows it. It's that kind of confidence that is just brought to them from an outside source. For Chris, it's Emily. For Jess, it's this book. And
I was about to say, I feel like Jess is like drunk on this idea of this book of like, oh my God, I am so confident and ready.
I get it now.
I get it. And Chris is drunk on regular alcohol. And the idea that Emily was like, it's you. As the headmaster of Lorelai's love life, you're the one who is selected. Your application has been accepted.
Correct.
And it's very different conclusions or like methods of conclusions, but they both kind of landed in the same spot. Delulu land. I feel like everyone kind of ends up in Delulu land. The pro for everyone being the same on this show, everyone ends up in Delulu land.
Everybody's kind of Delulu. It's so true. The other things that I had is that I feel like Rory and Jess kind of bond over their taste in music and books. She kind of says that when she's talking to Lane at the end of season 4. And I do think that that's also similar of Lorelai and Chris. It's like they love to talk about music. They love to crank Metallica in his Volvo, you know. And I think Jess kind of serves that purpose in her life, that they can bond over books and music and stuff that otherwise, you know, admittedly, Luke can't really do that with Lorelai.
No.
And Dean didn't really do that with Rory. I feel like they started to with books at the beginning, but then when they introduced the character of Jess, it was like,
I know,
that went out the window for Dean. But music-wise, I feel like that's a huge part of the Gilmore Girls' lives, and those two characters serve that purpose for them that other, like these other guys don't necessarily, but that doesn't mean they're not right for them. It's just like very enticing to have this boy in your life who like is into the same books and music, and it's just fun.
I think that's an interesting comparison between Luke and Chris for Lorelai, is because Luke does not like, well, Lorelai only reads a little bit, but doesn't watch the same TV, movies, music, any of that. It really is coming from Chris. And so when they get together, there's just this banter, this like similarity and sameness that they can keep up with each other. Not that Luke isn't keeping up with her bantering. He totally does.
He totally does.
And
but
that's also the style of the show. But sometimes when like Chris comes on and they're like having a moment, I'm like, you can't make me hate them. But I feel like it's kind of pulling us out of like, it's the format of the episode in general with this point. But I feel like Dean and Jess are Chris like together in that sameness, because if we pull apart Chris being like that first boyfriend, that young love, that kind of like learning relationship, first boyfriend vibes, that's pulling that out of Chris and being Dean. But if we're pulling out that like finally finding someone who gets like our taste in books and music and movies and is able to keep up with us in that regard, I think that's where that split comes from, is like it's allowing Rory to have a shift in a young relationship, which is honestly why I think they took that away from Dean early on.
They totally did.
Like, how can these boys be different? He likes music, he likes going to work. There we go.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's kind of a con I put down for Chris and Jess, was the work component. You know, when we finally get to that point with Jess where he's like, you have nothing, I have nothing. Christopher's never had nothing in his life.
No. And I said Chris inherits a lot from his family. Jess only inherits their trauma, is really what I said there.
And there is a lot of trauma and a lot of turmoil between Christopher and his parents, which
for sure.
You could argue the same for Jess, but I just not in the same way.
No, and it's complicated family relationships is not really a novelty of comparison on the show. It's just how families work. It was like that recent voicemail that one of our besties left where they were like listing off all the people who have not good relationships, and it was everyone. So like as it turned out, it was everyone. So it's not really like a novelty to have complicated relationships with your family, but I just mean it more in the sense that like when his father passes, Chris, or it's his grandfather that passes where he gets all the money, but he does come into quite a large sum of money offering castles, etc., to the Gilmore Girls, and Jess really only has the trauma of his father to work through, that he left behind, and the plot holes that his father leaves in the story. So I do agree with that there's just like the wealth disparity there is just giant. And in that same vein of that being different, the Gilmores love Chris, the Gilmores hate Jess.
So true. They definitely don't come from the same like familial situation, and so definitely a con, a difference between them. I also think that Christopher has anger in him from, you know, just being a human being, but he doesn't lead with surliness in the way that Jess does. I think that they both can be very passionate. Case in point, their declaration to the Gilmore Girls and being like, run away with me, I know you better than anyone, and kind of the Delulu-ness of that. But he's a little rougher around the edges, Jess, and Christopher's a little more charming, which is why I think he's compared to Logan a lot, is because they lead.
He leads with a smile.
With that. Yeah. He's a little more palatable, whereas Jess is enticing and exciting because he's kind of bad boy. Yeah. And
you know, I was actually going to say Chris is more excitable. Like, I feel like he gets excited about things. But what's exciting about Jess is that he is kind of a sad bad boy.
Yeah, bad boy who only has eyes for you. Whereas, you know, what we didn't really get from Jess that we did get from Christopher was another romance that threatened the relationship with a Gilmore Girl. You know, Lorelai trying to navigate Sherry and Chris and the dynamic there. Marie never really has to go through that. She kind of does with Shane, but not really. We never see Jess with anybody else.
It's really just that she wants to be with Jess. Jess just accepted things as they were, as Rory communicated them, and just had to move on his own. And Rory, in her possessive nature, wants Jess for herself and is going to be mean as a result of it.
Yeah, that's so true.
So, also she's blonde. Shane's blonde. Sherry's blonde.
That's true. They actually have the same color hair by season 3.
Yeah.
Cotton Candy Sherry.
See, this is the thing. Villainous women, blonde.
On this show. It's true.
You are also blonde.
Stop it. Don't tell anybody. The last similarity I had between the two of them is that they both flee to California after letting down a Gilmore Girl.
Is Luke the only man that doesn't go to California, though?
Dean.
But we never know where he went. No, there's no... Well, no, he could be a big small town boy. There's plenty of towns in California.
There are. Yeah. We never hear about Dean going to California. So that's kind of...
What a similarity. Add it to the list. Never went to California.
But that was everything I had. You know, I obviously had more for Dean and Luke. I think, though, that also comes with these characters. A similarity between both of them is that we get a lot of Dean and Luke as characters on the show.
Yeah.
Chris and Jess are similar characters in that they show up sporadically. Can I tell you something that absolutely cracked me up? Is that I Googled just to see if there was any information out there yet of people comparing these characters, Christopher Hayden and Jess Mariano. And the AI on Google said, Jess Mariano is a character played by Milo Ventimiglia. Christopher Hayden is a character on Gilmore Girls. It's just like no other context.
Oh, okay.
And it just made me laugh so hard that it was just like Christopher Hayden is a character on Gilmore Girls. Jess Mariano is a main character on Gilmore Girls portrayed by Jess. Milo
we know you have a crush.
And I was like, all right, Team Jess. AI is Team Jess. But I do think that they both kind of like pop in and out. And
well, yeah,
I think Jess is very developed. I don't think Chris is. I think Chris is developed throughout the show, and obviously more so in season 7.
I think it's the same thing of Luke and I'll say Luke and Duke. Luke and Dean is that Jess is the
Duke
very
Forrester
similar.
Is a really good name.
Luke and Duke and Jean. Jean Danes.
Hilarious.
Oh gosh, killing me. But Jess is a very similar, if not the same type of character that Luke is. He has his own storyline because like their storyline is together, but he also has, you know, we get a little spin-off session between the two of them, but he has a relationship with his mom and with TJ, and you know, the family dynamic there exists outside of the Gilmore Girls, and it doesn't really have any bearing on their storyline at all. Whereas Chris is really just coming in as a response to the Gilmore Girls. And so I think that the differences there are the same as Dean and Luke.
Yeah.
And I think that is sometimes why Jess and Luke get compared as well. It's because they serve the same type of character role on the show, whereas Dean and Chris don't necessarily get compared, but they are just love interests. They're just boyfriends.
Yeah, I think that Lorelai is really the only one that compares Dean and Chris like verbally on the show. Like he looks like Christopher, and maybe just the fact that they were both of their first boyfriends and kind of informed a lot of the way that they...
Which we don't know that was her first boyfriend.
Lorelai, it's not. Brian Hutchins, obviously, famously. Most of us get first boyfriends like Brian Hutchins, but I just mean to say like first love. I would argue that Christopher, is Lorelai's first love, and for Rory, Dean is her first love. So that's how they're kind of compared to one another. I will also say that another similarity between Jess and Chris is that I feel like their arms have to be twisted a little bit to get them to show up for people in their family.
Yeah.
You could make that argument kind of for...
talking. I thought you literally meant their arms get kind of twisted sometimes. I was thinking like behind their back, like just like they twist them in front of them, little cutesy girlies.
No.
My brain was like, and that's the end of the sentence, y'all. And then I kept listening because I was like, wait, maybe she has more to say.
I do. It's famously on the show. No. I always have more to say.
Famously is our favorite thing to say lately.
It's the word of 2025.
Yeah, famously.
But just thinking about like how Lorelai has to call Chris to be like, hey, you know, Rory has this thing and I'd really love for you to show up for her, like in presenting Lorelai Gilmore, and in, you know, with the debate and it should have been Lorelai when he shows up with Sherry, you know, like certain things where it's like, hey, your daughter would really love for you to show up. Like we would really love for you to be here. I feel like it's not as intense, but Luke showing up to New York to be like, come to your mom's wedding. You need to come to your mom's wedding. You owe me. You know, and the way that Lorelai presents it is a little more fun in presenting Lorelai Gilmore. She's like, I know that this is the last thing you want to do, but your daughter has, you know, has always kind of taken it that you're not here and she'd really love for you to be here. And like kind of comes in prepared with a speech because they are a little difficult to kind of get a hold of and pin down. And I think that that is also very Jess Mariano.
Yeah. And what's interesting is I think a lot of the times when we see Chris and he is asked to do these things, he's like, yeah, I'll do it. And when we see it, he's always game to do it. But the way that they approach it leads us to believe that it's very hard to ask him to do things. Like I'm thinking of You've Been Gilmored when Rory and Lorelai are sitting on the couch and he was like, hey, and Lorelai says to Rory like, hey, you know who would like a Yale sweatshirt? Your dad. You should take him on a tour. And she's like, would he like that? It's just this idea of like he's hard to get into these parental situations. And but in action he was always kind of accepting of it, but it seems through like the effort of it that it is hard to get him to do it. Totally. And it kind of also seems like the thing of like, where is he at graduation? So and I know that could be an actor thing,
that was an actor
at the end of the day
sure.
in the narrative it makes it seem
where
like,
are you?
Where are you, my dude? You don't even show up.
So where do we land on this one? Or where do you land,
have one
rather?
more.
Oh, tell me.
And this feels like it's for the earlier seasons, but it seems like Chris is leaving for other people, and that's what's hurting Lorelai because she wanted him to leave whatever he was doing to come and show up for them, but he leaves for Sherry, and that is like the ultimate like pain. And I think that time and time again that's kind of where they exist, is he wanted to be there for her and she said no, you're not ready, and when he was ready he left for other people. Even when he tried to come back in Haunted Leg, he really couldn't come back. He was still going to show up for these other people that it just was never going to work out for him. So it was really, you're really unsure of what he wanted. Or I don't think Jess left for other people. I think Jess left for himself.
Jess was kind of almost forced to leave in a lot of ways. It was as a result of his own choices, but yeah, you're so right. Jess was never necessarily choosing anybody else over Rory except for maybe Walmart. You know what I mean?
Where was that in the Walmart commercial?
Yeah.
Jess Mariano showing up to work.
Or Jess Mariano being like a part owner of Walmart.
Oh my gosh. He has his books published at Walmart. He's a Walmart book pick of the month.
Oh my God, that would be so fun.
That would be amazing.
So where do you land on all of this with Jess and Christopher?
Like which kind of outweighs, like if they feel more similar than they do different. You know, some of their differences are kind of what make them similar, is like they leave, but like it's kind of like the reason behind why they're leaving is what makes them different. Yeah. And like they're complicated families, but it's of different classes of families. And so I think that when you get into the specifics, it's very different. But I think in general, for the most part, they're very similar. And I think
they serve very similar purposes in the Gilmore's lives, which is different from Dean and Luke in that we were comparing them as characters. And there are comparisons here that like with Jess and Chris, we could say like, yeah, they are similar in XYZ way. But I just feel like they serve very similar purposes in the Gilmore Girls' lives.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that sometimes when I'm looking at the cons, I'm trying to look at like the weight of them, because the different types of characters that they serve, that for me initially at the beginning was serving a lot of weight, that like it's just like how they show up in the story is just so different that to like make too many like similarities between the two of them, it's like it really comes back to that core of how they show up in the show. But I don't always think it has to be. I don't think it necessarily has to be that much more weight given to it than the rest of the similarities.
Totally. I love it. I loved doing this.
I know. I wouldn't say like Dean and Chris are similar because they are boyfriends, or like Jess and Luke are more similar because, no, I would say Jess and Luke are more similar because they have like that type of storyline, but I wouldn't say that Dean and Chris are because they don't. So I think that like I can't put too much more weight in that con if I'm not going to put it into the pros too.
I'm with you.
Now that I'm with you.
Full circle moment.
Every episode
honestly.
This season we're talking about Jessica Simpson.
Which, speaking of, we have our Gilmore Galentine event coming up on February 13th. Just a
Speaking
reminder,
of Jessica Simpson,
because our first Gilmore Galentine episode that we recorded, we sang With You by Jessica Simpson when we recorded for 3 hours. So maybe you'll get a little karaoke from us. Who's to say? But
please expect karaoke, unprompted, unasked for, unsolicited. Like
But tickets to that can be found at www.moment.co/Gilmore To Say, or in our show notes. You can just click the little link in our, below or next to, or wherever it shows up for you. It'll be there.
Pretty sure it's below.
Yeah.
But if you are a Patreon member, you can come to the after party for free.
It's going to be silly. We're going to have a lot of fun.
It is going to be silly.
But I'm so glad we got to do this today. I absolutely loved exploring this. It's something new and something different. It had me really excited. And again, like I said at the beginning, a little bit of a nod to our second episode of the podcast ever.
Yeah.
Again, in a very different way. And that's what I love about it, is that we can explore these characters in ways we've never thought of before, even 3 years later.
I know. And
Crazy.
It's really from our besties. Our besties, like, y'all make us think about the show very differently. That you'll bring up little thoughts that we're like, oh, wow, there's nothing more than when y'all call in with a voicemail where my flabbers are gasted, and by the end of it, I'm agreeing with you. But
it's true.
In you talking about our second episode of our first season of Gilmore To Say, I feel like our third episode of this season is kind of similar, because our first season third episode was Jess, as we mentioned earlier, and how he's romanticized because we put a lot more onto this character than is seen on the screen, or we project our own hopes and dreams into this man. And I don't think this character who we're going to talk about in this next third episode of season 4 is necessarily romanticized to the same degree, but I think that people see a lot more potential in him than is given to us on the screen, and that is Marty.
And we'll have more to say on that in the next episode.